This is Counter-Argument, a Middle East podcast from the Crown Center for Middle East Studies at Brandeis University. In part one of this two-part episode of Counter-Argument, we spoke with Golnar Nikpour, assistant professor of history at Dartmouth College, about the expansion of prisons in 20th century Iran, and took a closer look at the significance of the notorious Evin prison within Iran's carceral system. In part two, drawing on her book project about the history of Iranian prisons and prisoners in a global context, Professor Nikpour addresses some of the misconceptions about how and why people end up in Iran's prisons, as well as the regime's use of new technologies to surveil the population. My name is Naghmeh Sohrabi. We are the Crown Center for Middle East Studies, and this is Counter-Argument. You've described so beautifully the ways in which, in the post-revolutionary period, there's a mixing of lines between social crimes, political crimes, what's anti-Islamic, what's anti-revolutionary. So bringing it for a second to the moment in which we're in today, one of the things that your work makes me think about are the ways in which it's not just about common law prisoners and then political prisoners, but actually what constitutes a political crime, right? And that issue, even though people don't talk about it a lot, seems to have been really brightened and brought to our attention because of the events of the fall of 2022. So what I mean is, I was thinking about the 4 men who were executed in response to those protests, and their profile isn't what we think of when we think about, for example, the political prisoners who were executed during the monarchy period before the 1979 revolution. When we think about those people, we think about them as students, poets, profiles like that. But today, what we're talking about, when we talk about these young men, many of them are laborers. They were working in the gig sectors of the economy, and they came out into the streets to protest. Then they were arrested, and then they were executed on a political charge. Or even thinking about Mahsa Amini, whose death sets off all these protests that have been going on. She's arrested and then dies in police custody because she's not wearing her veil or hijab properly. And that's a supposed reason for why she's taken into custody. So all of this background leads to the question of, is not veiling properly a political crime, or is it not a political crime? So I was wondering, in the context of a diversity of prisoners, can you talk to us a bit about these invisible lines between political crimes and non-political crimes in the Islamic Republic, and how it functions in this moment that we're in today?
I love this question because I think you actually articulated it very beautifully, that some of the figures, that really have captured our collective imaginations and have helped us see these repressive structures that organize life in Iran, the way in which these lines are drawn, it's important to understand, and it's also important to kind of understand the way in which it might ensnare just about anybody. So if I have one kind of big message in my work, I really want us to think hard about the hard and fast, kind of hermetically sealed categories we have called so-called political prisoners on the one hand and non-political prisoners on the other. Now, part of it is that line actually is drawn by the Iranian government. And the way that it's drawn, both under the Pahlavi government and in the Islamic Republic, as I said, the Islamic Republic is constantly saying that it doesn't have political prisoners. And then we laugh, we say, well, that's absurd. But what they mean is that they're not being tried under some law called political prison law or something. It's the language of national security is what's typically used. Sometimes the language of terrorism. So especially in the sort of era of the so-called war on terror, you'll get a lot of, well, these people are terrorists. That also happened before the revolution to some extent with the guerrilla movement. So you get these other essentially security laws that are used. And the way that they're discussed in the context of prison wards where they are held is that these are security detainees. But from the beginning of the modern prison system in Iran, there have been these distinctions. Before I explain how these lines, I think, are a little bit less real than we imagine, I want to first at least explain where the lines come from. There's a reason we think in the categories we do, and in some sense, they've been bequeathed to us by the Iranian government. So it's not only a distinction between what the government will call security prisoners and ordinary prisoners, Zendaniya Adi, what I've been referring to as common law prisoners. But there's distinctions within the types of so-called ordinary prisoners. So people who are held on financial crimes, things like embezzlement or fraud, are typically held in different wards. So when there was this fire in Evin, we got some first-person testimony. Some of the closest people to what happened were the people who were held in the ward for those on financial crimes. Sometimes you will hear in the US context, people talk about financial crimes as white-collar crimes, things like embezzlement and so forth. They're not always actually done by white-collar people, but that's just the language that we've developed here. But at any rate, even within, as I said, that category of ordinary crimes, there's these different subcategories. So qasr from the beginning was like, this is where the drug users will be held. This is where the smugglers will be held. This is where murderers and rapists will be held. This is where security criminals will be held. And actually, the security folks, the political prisoners, were always held even more sort of apart, theoretically, although there's always been some mixing. So the lines are, in fact, material ones. People have different experiences once they go into the prison, depending on what they have been accused of and what they have been charged with. And of course, one of the things I also want to say is that a large number of detainees in Iran, and one of the reasons our numbers are imperfect, is we also don't have a totally clear understanding, virtually in any prison system, how many detainees simply haven't met bail. And so they're simply awaiting trial. So there are numbers of people who are even on sometimes very low bail amounts. You know, is that a political prisoner, somebody who is simply too poor to pay bail? So they're basically being held hostage by the government for a payment, right? That's what bail more or less amounts to. So one of the things is there are material differences. So when we're talking about the experience of prison, the experience of what happens when you get arrested, who you're interacting with, who you're interfacing with, you're obviously much more likely to be interfacing with the intelligence arms of the state, either the IRGC or the Ministry of Intelligence, if you're a so-called security prisoner, aka a political prisoner, as opposed to, at this point, people who are being held on drug charges and so forth. So there are meaningful differences in how you're being treated. At the same time, my work suggests to me, and what I suggest here, is that we have to think about the historical context to get at what I'm really interested in. So even as early as the 1920s, when there was only a couple of hundred people being held in Tehran-based prisons, it's not that people at that time weren't doing drugs or doing petty crimes or doing fraud or doing whatever else, you know, getting into a fight in the street or whatever else you might be incarcerated for, handing out political pamphlets. But it means that over the course of really just a century, the expectation that the government will be heavily policing and surveilling its citizenry and will be sequestering some increasing numbers of them who they deem to be sort of social deviants, social problems, social trouble. Some increasing number of them are being incarcerated decade after decade. Now, after 1979, this really expands. This expands quite dramatically. Whereas I said, the revolutionary government comes to power and it says that as a result of this transformative Islamic revolution, where we're going to have a truly just Islamic revolutionary society, it promises essentially the eradication of drug use. It promises the eradication of what it views to be sexual deviance, including sex work, but also what it views as sort of deviant sexual behavior between two or however many consenting adults. The idea of what is being policed, in my view, thinking about the Islamic Republic helps us see that these are political decisions, regardless of the type of government it is, right? The fact that there are around the world hundreds of millions of people in prison for using drugs is a political decision, because the Islamic Republic, much like any other government, could be deciding, okay, what we're going to do with drug users is get them healthcare. It's not a crime, it's a health issue, right? There's a million options for how you're going to solve a social problem. But the carceral imaginary says that we solve social problems through carceral means. So as I said, you know, that could be anything from what it views, the Islamic Republic views as sexual deviance, to price gouging, to drug use. And in fact, it does change its attitudes towards drug use in the 1990s, 2000s, and into the present day, where it has sort of absorbed harm reduction models, in part because of the spread of infectious disease in Iranian prisons. So, you know, these are all political processes. These are political decisions. How we treat, for instance, a sex worker is a political decision. I want to denaturalize the idea that there are real criminals who deserve being incarcerated and executed. Iran not only has high per capita numbers of people in prison, but it also executes an extremely high number of people, especially when you put it in comparison. In fact, it's more executionary than it is carceral in how it stacks up to governments around the world.
It means that it executes a higher number percentage-wise than it imprisons, right?
Yes, slightly. I mean, it's a very high level in the scheme of things. It's one of the more heavily carceral countries in the world, both in terms of the number of people per capita it incarcerates and in terms of the number of detainees per capita that it executes. But it's a little worse in the execution side than on the incarceration side. I don't want to let off the hook any of that, but just to give us a sense of how it stacks up. Part of it is that the United States, which really laps the field in incarceration, makes Iran look better by comparison. His numbers are so off the charts. It's like 50 times worse than anything else. And similarly, China at the execution level is the worst, but Iran stacks up a little worse in comparison. So it's nothing to brag about that it's better at one thing, but it's still how it is. So what I'm trying to get at is that one of the things that my work really sort of taught me is that, after the revolution, Islamic Republic comes to power promising a utopia. It's making a utopian promise about the kind of system and the type of world that Iranians are going to get to live in. It says the reason that there is such a problem with drug use in the country is because of social degradation under the Shah and westernization and these kinds of ways of getting away from what brings people spiritual harmony and getting away from Islam and so forth. So it destroys the historic red light district in Tehran, and it says nothing like this needs to exist ever again. And it says that it's going to execute all of these drug users and what it's calling smugglers and so forth. But to me, these are all political decisions. And once you start to see that, it helps you see how much incarceration in general in Iran was a political decision. Reza Shah, when he is talking about building tens of new prisons in the country, he says that this will usher in an era of progress and humanity and modernity, that it will put Iran in the sort of broader context of modern states that have these humane ways of punishing social deviance. And in fact, in that earlier moment, there is this kind of promise, both under Reza Shah and Mohammad Reza Shah, where the institutions in charge of running the prisons and the people in charge of prisons are promising that prisons are necessary to train and educate Iranians. They start these labor programs and education programs and so forth, so that eventually these sort of social deviants or antisocial elements will be transformed into good citizens, people who are actually productive members of society. And interestingly, the Islamic Republic uses, it's not the same language because it is in a different ideological and sort of conceptual framework. But if you go to the Prisons Organization website, it says you might come in as a drug user or somebody who's on petty crimes or whatever, but there will be these physical education, literacy classes, skills classes, and they call what they do Amuzeshgah Niki, virtue training schools. In the Shah's time, it was about being kind of modern secular citizens. Now it's about being proper modern Islamic citizens, right? But yet there's this promise, increasingly not emphasized because it's obviously not coming to pass, that prisons will help cure recidivism or cure people from these antisocial impulses. And the Islamic Republic really came to power promising this, promising that soon there would be no drug use. When Khomeini died, a person who supported him wrote into the New York Times and said, essentially, no one in human history has done more to eradicate drug use in the world. And now we know that this is incredibly wrong. That kind of zero tolerance policy, all of the studies show that it simply doesn't work. And it didn't work in Iran. Drug use is a much bigger problem today than it was at the time of Khomeini's death, when this guy said that drug use had been essentially eradicated. So again, my emphasis is just trying to think about these things in a broader picture. And just very, very briefly, what I want to say about what your really excellent point was about these protesters who are being ensnared in this, whether hijab law is political crime or not. I think you and I agree that, of course, that it is. I think most people would actually probably see it that way. But you start to see how it's not the political prisoner that you picture in your mind, like, an intellectual or somebody who is writing political treatises. No, on the contrary, it's very much ordinary people who are making personal decisions or ordinary everyday decisions and are being ensnared in a surveillance state. And really understanding who's vulnerable in the Iranian state helps you understand some of the ways that these have played out. I would say that young women are particularly vulnerable to this kind of hyper-policing, particularly in Tehran, but around Iran. And that's really what ensnares Mahsa Amini and kind of kicks off these recent round of protests. But if the reason that it became so massive right away is I think so many Iranians actually saw themselves in her or have had run-ins with the police like that made them understand just how vulnerable they are to that type of policing.
Even that itself is continuity, right? I mean, at the end of the day, it seems like the actions of the state, whether it's the Pahlavi monarchy or the Islamic Republic, that determines the label political. But you said something, and it's another question I have. You were talking about these vulnerable people being in a surveillance state. And it made me think about, at the time, back in the winter of 2022, people talked a lot about Iran has shut down its guidance control. There was this going on for a while. We're talking about Gashte Irshad, as they say it in Persian. And then some other people say, oh, no, it hasn't. And some people protested to the news saying, oh, this news is trying to take attention off that movement. But what has stayed with me after all these weeks, it's in connection to what you just mentioned in passing, which is that in response to this news about getting rid of the guidance patrol, a spokesperson for one of these bodies that was in charge of it said something like, oh, yeah, we have shut down the Gashte Irshad, but we're now going to use newer technologies. And he said there's like a new plan for veiling in chastity that's going to happen in a new framework and to use, quote, relevant technology. I personally found that to be such a chilling statement. And I was wondering how you understand what he's talking about when he says newer technology. What technologies are there for surveilling the everyday? You know, this falls back on the previous point you were making about the ways in which the everyday can become criminal in the Islamic Republic. So are these really new technologies, or is there actually a history within the Islamic Republic for using technology to surveil the everyday of the people and then to turn normal human activity into a crime?
Absolutely. When I saw that, it really perked my attention because I think it has a longer standing genealogy, not an ancient genealogy, of course, but a longer standing one, not even actually that old of one. And the Islamic Republic has been, in my view, since its inception, it's not a static kind of entity. And even in terms of its approach to surveillance and policing, it's constantly experimenting with new forms. In the last decade or so, one of the things that I think is actually not very well understood, I haven't seen it discussed very much in the Anglophone world, is that there has been a concerted effort on the part of the government to reduce its number of people in prisons, mostly, again, on lower level charges, things like drug charges and so forth, but lower level ones, such that even some of the people who are imagined as hardliners or kind of government stalwarts, judiciary conservatives and so forth, are talking about trying to have fewer people be incarcerated, in part because there just isn't space, in part because it's expensive, in part because it's socially disruptive, and in part because of disease, right? So COVID was the sort of last, most recent, most devastating instantiation of that, but there have been really serious outbreaks of major infectious disease in Iran starting in the 90s with HIV/AIDS in prisons that has been quite devastating. So the judiciary reduced the number of charges on which you could be held without bail and all sorts of little things around the edges to try to reduce the number of people in prison. One of the things I argue in my work is that we cannot, absolutely not look at this as decarceralization. In other words, look at it as a reduction of the kind of surveillance and prison and punishment apparatus of the state. What they're talking about is what scholars in another context, in the US context, call prison by another name. And that includes things like ankle monitors for people who are released into their own homes, house arrest with ankle monitors, in other words, biometric technologies, facial recognition software, new sort of broader use fingerprint recognition software that can be used in public, even when people don't know they're being surveilled in those ways.
Like what? Can you give an example?
Yeah, I'll give an example. The best example I have is of facial recognition software. So one of the things that started to be used in the last 5 years or so, we know that, for instance, there's a big problem with inflation, currency inflation, and radical drops in value of Iranian currency. One of the things that this means is that people are always sort of using gray markets, black markets to get non-Iranian currency, dollars and euros, which are more stable. So there's all sorts of illegal happenings around that. So if you've been to any major Iranian city recently, you know that there's a place you can go in the bazaar, near the economic centers of these cities where you can exchange, like people line up and try to get the guy's attention and give them their Iranian currency and get dollars, whether they want to just have it or whether they want to travel for whatever reason that they need to do these currency exchanges. Part of this is also a function of Iran being sort of removed from normal global finance systems as a result of sanctions, similarly to Russia or Venezuela or whatever. So there's all of these new technologies that's been placed around those centers that does facial recognition. Now, it's longer standing, of course, that Iranians know that photos might be taken of them or video might be taken of them at a protest or wherever. But there's now also the kind of facial recognition tech that recognize some person who's already been arrested and maybe has been sentenced for these financial crimes is now in the bazaar or in this marketplace. And this person might be, let's say, breaking the terms of their parole or breaking the terms of their post-release specifications for what they're supposed to be doing, right? And so they might then run afoul of the state again. Now, one of the places that this biotech also comes into play is a lot of it is being sort of rolled out and used on the eastern border where there has been a lot of Afghan refugees who have come in.
And that's connected to the drug trade also, right?
Yes, that's absolutely connected with the drug trade, and both the reason or the excuse, depending on how much credit you want to give what the Islamic Republic formally says. Of course, there's an enormous drug trade that does come in through that border, and that the Islamic Republic works with all of these international institutions, including the UN, to try to curtail that drug trade. But there are also just hundreds of thousands of ordinary people. I mean, between Iraqi and Afghan refugees in the country, there's over 1 million. These are people who have to in order to get documentation and so forth. And some live in essentially camp settings, and biotech is used to make sure that they're under surveillance. And it's essentially the sort of criminalization of immigration that you see in other contexts. Now, it's particular to Iran because who's coming and for what and what the purposes are and what the context is particular. And the Iranian government, of course, uses the collapses and continued violence and quagmires in Afghanistan and Iraq to point fingers at the US and say, hey, look what happens when the US invades your country. But it also turns around when those, in some cases, quite vulnerable people come in, it surveils them and it uses all of this new tech. Now, the most, I think, similar to what we're seeing today and the real precursor, I think, the most close analog to what you mentioned at the top of this question is that right around what I think of as the beginning of the height of COVID, so February, March, April 2020, people in Tehran started getting summonses, text messages. So it's interesting because it was through text, which is already new technology, right? People are like, whoa, essentially the Gasht Irshad, the morality police, guidance police, whatever you want to call them, have my phone number and they're texting me a summons because they're saying that I wasn't wearing proper hijab in my car. So they're summoned to come to this office to report to the morality police within 10 days, to sign affidavits promising not to break the hijab rules again. Now, people were extremely pissed for a couple of reasons. As I'm sure we all remember, Iran has been devastated by COVID. And early in 2020, it was just utterly devastated by coronavirus. So people are trying to shelter in place, but they're being told by police that they have to appear to sign these affidavits. So they're mad for that reason. And of course, they're also mad because they're being surveilled in their cars. And the way that they were being surveilled is that they're using these new traffic enforcement cameras. So that's another example of this totally, in a way, what has become kind of commonplace global technology. In the US, we think of it as something that you might get a ticket for speeding or running a red light or something. This is something I say through the 100 years of prison history that I look at. When I say that we have to take the global in consideration, it's exactly in this way, where you're taking the global in consideration, you understand that something has analogs, but it's also deeply particular, right? I'm not aware of another government that's using this tech in quite this way. And of course, this raised all of these big debates in the public sphere in Iran about whether or not your car is public or private space. That's a longer standing debate. And in fact, there were clerical voices who said, hey, I'm not so sure about this, or who said, it depends on the place. If you're in a crowded city, then it's the public. But if you're in, somewhere where there aren't that many people, then it's more private. So there was all of these debates about whether or not this was actually properly Islamic. But then it's talking about traffic enforcement cameras, something that there's no Islamic law. There's nothing in Sharia that says, and this is the Sharia position on traffic enforcement cameras. cameras, right? But it's an example of the way in which, these global technologies are being used in these very particular ways. And the ankle monitor thing, I think, is also really, really important because they're increasingly being used and they're extremely expensive for the people who are made to use them.
Oh, so they have to pay for it. The state's not going to pay for it?
Yes, that is not an innovation of the Islamic Republic. If you hear of someone who is being held on ankle monitors in the US, they also have to pay daily, which actually produces all of these really, really difficult issues. Like if you're under house arrest, let's say you're under house arrest somewhere in Iran, and you have to pay however much daily for the use of this. It's like you could either be in prison or you can be at home. You'd rather be at home. At least you might be with your family or able to see loved ones from time to time, even if you can't leave. But you have to pay, but you can't work because you can't leave your house. So, like a lot of these other norms and standards, anything from bail to this type of punitive ankle monitor software, it really penalizes and criminalizes poverty, makes it much more likely that if you're poor, you're going to go back into prison. And it also means it's not only that you'd go back to serve your initial term, but if you mess up paying, you might get further prison time slapped onto you, right? So it's like actually deeply criminalizing of poverty.
Basically, it's technology allowing for what you were talking about in response to an earlier question, right?
Yeah.
About the blurring of the lines so that the everyday becomes criminal and criminal can be political. So it's always political in some sense, right?
Yeah, and I think you can start to see how, depending on what class or group you belong to, you might come into contact with different parts of this technology. So if you're, let's say, an Afghan refugee, certain technology might be used on you to like get your fingerprints and face and everything in a database. If you're a relatively poor person from a working class background who is caught doing some petty thieving or something and tries to get out on ankle monitor and then is sort of not able to pay and is recriminalized and further criminalized for that, that's one way you might interact with the surveillance arm of the state. If you're, let's say, a young woman who has a car, it's not that that's only one class group, but still, if you're a young woman who has a car, maybe just put her hijab like an inch off her head as she's driving, or it slips off and you get a summons to come in. That was a kind of pilot program that I think we're going to see more of. I'm very skeptical of the idea of this morality policing, even if this specific institution is reconfigured or changed or closed. It's very, very clear that the Islamic Republic is really borderline obsessed with the issue of hijab as a marker of that kind of Islamic citizenship that it wants to promote. So yeah, these are all pilot programs, in my view, of what your question raised, which is that we're only going to see more of this technology used going forward, I think. So even if we do see some minor reduction eventually, I mean, we're only seeing more people being arrested right now, but even if some of those people are released, I think we're going to see the line between inside and outside is only going to be more and more blurred as surveillance tech becomes more and more state of the art.
I want to ask, as a way of bringing it all together, if there's anything in your fantastic research, either historically or in terms of what's going on today, that you were surprised about when you encountered. Was there something that you were just not expecting to see and it just blew your mind?
Well, thank you so much. As I've done this research, I've also had my mind blown many times, sometimes in ways that are unpleasant. But I mean, many times when you're reading about prisons and torture and incarceration, it's dark. So it's not always easy. I think that for me, I'll answer both historically briefly and in terms of today. And I'll try to take us away from that incredibly sinister place we were just in, not just to be fake optimistic, but to actually say what I am, I think, often surprised by is something that is a point of optimism for me. And that is that from the beginning, and certainly continuing into the current moment, one of the things that I'm always blown away by is the fact that just as the government of Iran learns how to better surveil, how to better punish, how to better control how people are behaving within the prison. This is a big issue for political prisoners, is that there's constantly efforts to sort of disallow certain forms of organizing and certain forms of sociality. But so do people. That's one of the really remarkable things. People are constantly, and you can almost think of it as a cat and mouse game. But the mouse gets away. It's able to actually sort of learn from the ways in which it's being surveilled to get around certain forms of both surveillance and policing on the one hand and incarceration on the other. And that this effort to create this space of total enclosure, the government's idea and effort is always to sort of be able to totally close people off in these spaces and to remake them, right? These forced confessions are meant to be a sign of how totally the government can remake and reshape a person's very subjecthood, right? And it certainly has won in specific instances, but there's also ways in which this knowledge circulates, knowledge of how to get away circulates. There's this kind of archive of people learning tactics of how to deal with interrogation, how to deal with policing. A former political prisoner I talked to talks about how when he'd go to protests, he would wear like 10 coats so that if he got beaten or clubbed, he wouldn't feel it and could maybe run away. He was like, I was always sweating, but it was better than getting knocked over, right? This was because somebody told him this might happen. It's a minor example, but the point is that just as the government is constantly kind of learning, there's this constant effort to stay ahead of each other. And that's one of the things I find heartening is that even with this incredibly sinister technology, a huge technological advantage, right? There are actually all sorts of ways in which even these new technologies, the internet, texting, also has a kind of democratizing knowledge spreading capacity. That's why we see such contestations over those spaces, who gets to speak, how speaking happens in those meetings. And even that is a global phenomenon, right? Because prisoners in Iran get global solidarity and sort of speak across these carceral lines to where people incarcerated in other spaces are also sort of learning from and looking to the Iranian movement as kind of leaders in how to deal with this type of police surveillance. In my view, that's extremely moving. And as far as the current situation goes, I'll actually use this confusion, let's say, over what is going to happen with the so-called morality police, where there have been some statements made by members of the government gesturing to the idea that it might be reshaped, reconfigured, closed down, working through seeing what that might look like. And for me, that was actually a surprise. Of course, there was a huge blowback about some of the headlines that we saw that were maybe kind of jumping the gun on how big of a change was going to happen. We should always do that kind of media watchdog and make sure that the information that's out there is accurate, especially because translation is challenging. But I actually, for me, as somebody who watches this stuff fairly closely and has for many years, I found that even the statements that did come out rather surprising in the sense that, I invite those of us who are rallying and wish to see the success of the protest movement to see that as a kind of victory, in the sense that it has at least some people thinking about needing to kind of rebrand, reconfigure, rethink. It has put on its heels something that was actually on the offensive 6 months ago, is now on the defensive. Now, that's not a total victory, right? It's not like, okay, we're done and we can go home. And that's what I think people got frustrated about the headlines. But for me, that's actually a certain kind of sign, a sign that at least in some ways, there are these cracks in what wants to present itself as a system that is not going to change because a few rabble-rousers and rioters want it to change, right? Even if it's just a rebrand, in admitting the need to do that, it understands that it needs some level of ideological cohesion, buy-in, et cetera, from at least some segment of the citizenship. And it's trying to make a world that is getting that buy-in. So for me, that being knocked on the defensive is actually something to, at least in the moment, kind of celebrate and then think about what the next steps are tactically.
Thank you so much, Golnar. I think of the number of not just misconceptions that you shed light on, but also the partial conceptions and partial understandings of Iran in a historical sense and also in the moment. It was just an incredible tour de force. And I would say in some ways, I feel like the strongest counter argument that you made today is in just drawing our attention to the light that exists in the darkness. And I really, really appreciate the time and the knowledge that you brought to this.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. And, for me, that's the thing I vacillate between, like not knowing if we should emphasize how bad things are, really sound the alarm, or trying to point to all the ways that we should celebrate the minor victories, whether it's just the optimist in me or what. I think it's important to remember those things too, because in struggle, there's very rarely complete victory. And if you don't mark even the ways you've won minor victories, then it becomes very hard to get up and keep going the next day. Even in doing this type of research, it gets hard to get up if I'm like, oh my God, it's only going to be bleak. So yeah, thank you for giving me an opportunity to talk about all of it. I appreciate that.
Thank you. You've been listening to Counter Argument, a Middle East podcast from the Crown Center for Middle East Studies at Brandeis University. Please join us next time for more insights into the region's politics, history, society, and economics.